Today. Thank you, Judith.
The reading today is taken from Matthew's Gospel, chapter 7, beginning to read at verse 21. True and false disciples. Not everyone who says to me, Lord, Lord, will enter the kingdom of heaven, but only the one who does the will of my Father who is in heaven. Many will say to me on that day, Lord, Lord, did we not prophesy in your name, and in your name drive out demons, and in your name perform many miracles? Then I will tell them plainly, I never knew you. Away from me, you evildoers. Therefore, everyone who hears these words of mine and puts them into practice is like a wise man who built his house on the rock. The rain came down, the streams rose, and the winds blew and beat against that house. Yet it did not fall, because it had its foundation on the rock. But everyone who hears these words of mine and does not put them into practice is like a foolish man who built his house on sand. The rain came down, the streams rose, and the winds blew and beat against that house, and it fell with a great crash. When Jesus had finished saying these things, the crowds were amazed at his teaching, because he taught as one who had authority, and not as their teachers of the law. This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God.
Thanks, Judith.
Now, Alan Saunders is going to come and bring the message for the day to conclude our service, our series of sermons on the kingdom. Thank you, Alan.
Just wait on Garth. Have we got... Yep, that's good, thank you. It's all right. So, there we go, a little reminder of where we've been over the last 10 or so weeks in this series, as we've been looking at this Sermon on the Mount, this preach from Jesus to the crowds there. We started back in Matthew chapter 5, verses 1 to 12, many weeks ago. And today we come to the end of that series. We're into the back end of chapter 7. And we're looking at this subject of the kingdom and kingdom commitment to understand what it means to be a kingdom-focused church or kingdom-focused people in our lives, how that is lived out, how we can reflect it in every aspect of our lives and in our work as a church. I hope, like me, you've benefited from the content. I think huge thanks go to all the preachers who've been involved week by week, who have handled what has been some highly challenging passages with tremendous skill and communicated so brilliantly to us, haven't they? Now, I chose the kingdom theme because I felt it was the right time for us as a church, as God's people here, in God's community here, to refocus our attention, the part that we play individually, in our families, in our groups, and corporately as God's church in bringing the kingdom here in our community in Lee as it is in heaven. We started 10 weeks ago as Adam kicked us off, and Adam will be at his new church at St Mark's, Worsley. This morning he's now left us. We wish him the best with that and pray for him. But Adam had the privilege of starting us off with the Beatitudes in Matthew chapter 5, verses 1 to 12, and looking at the theme of kingdom values. For me, it was a revelation as I started to look at this passage afresh, when I learnt that those first 9 verses, verses 3 to 12, were the content of Jesus' sermon. So often, when we preach, the content seems to be the bulk of the sermon. Actually, the content was just the beginning part, the Beatitudes, the beautiful attitudes. It was the following 3 chapters which Jesus used as the application of that sermon, those things mean for us in the way in which we live our lives out in a kingdom way. And have you got the buttons? Cheers. So we're moving on to this subject of kingdom commitment as we're bringing it. And as Jesus approaches the end of the Sermon on the Mount, he is not looking for an immediate response, suddenly a knee-jerk reaction to what he's said. But he is looking for a kingdom commitment, something that's been considered and informed and committed. I'm going to show you now how Jesus worked the crowd towards an understanding of that, so that they were properly prepared to be able to give a response. Jesus doesn't push the listeners to respond. He prepares them to respond. I've said the content of the Sermon on the Mount is the Beatitudes, verses 3 to 12, and the application is the following 3 chapters. And those end in Matthew chapter 7, verse 12, with the golden rule that says, "So in everything do to others what you would have them do to you." And this sums up the law and the prophets, Jesus said. Then the response preparation starts in Matthew chapter 7, verse 13. And in fact, everything from chapter 7, verse 13 to chapter 7, verse 27 is Jesus taking time to prepare the listeners to respond deliberately and thoughtfully to his message. And here's how he prepares them to respond. First of all, he tells 4 stories. And we're going to unpack each of those stories. Each of those stories has 2 possible outcomes and the need for one overall response from the listeners. And this is our personal response. So the first story is about 2 gates and can be found in Matthew 7, verse 13 and 14. I've got it there on the screen. Jesus said, "Enter through the narrow gate. For wide is the gate and broad is the road that leads to destruction, and many enter through it. But small is the gate and narrow is the road that leads to life, and only a few find it." Jesus is offering 2 contrasting ways. He puts it in a number of ways, doesn't he? Easy or hard. The route that has many or few. The route that is wide or narrow. These contrasts lead us to the ultimate contrast with 2 possible outcomes from this first story. The road that leads to life versus the road that leads to destruction. It's challenging stuff, isn't it, actually? Jesus isn't mincing his words here. He's giving the listeners a big choice to make. Do you want to make the road that leads to life, or do you want to journey down that road that leads to destruction? Then Jesus goes on to a second story, and that can be found in Matthew chapter 7, verses 15 to 20. And again, I've got it here on the screen for us. Verse 15, Jesus says, "Watch out for false prophets. They come to you in sheep's clothing, but inwardly they are ferocious wolves. By their fruit you will recognize them. Do people pick grapes from thornbushes or figs from thistles? Likewise, every good tree bears good fruit, but a bad tree bears bad fruit. A good tree cannot bear bad fruit, and a bad tree cannot bear good fruit. Every tree that does not bear good fruit is cut down and thrown into the fire. Thus, by their fruit you will recognize them." Here, Jesus is teaching us how to distinguish between false and true prophets. I think he's teaching the crowd this to help them make this informed decision he's leading them towards. Because Jesus was making such radical claims about Jewish law in this sermon, about the Torah that they would have known and understood, which would inevitably lead the listeners to question, how do I know if this man is a true prophet? Is Jesus the real deal, you might say? Can I trust him? And so Jesus offers a simple test to use. He says, inspect the fruit of my life and ministry, and you can decide for yourself. Actually, if you read on further in the Gospel of Matthew, chapter 11 and verse 2, John the Baptist says a similar thing. Here it is. When John, who was in prison at the time, heard about the deeds of the Messiah, he sent his disciples to ask him, "Are you the one who is to come, or should we expect someone else?" And Jesus replied by saying, "Go back and report to John what you hear and see. The blind receive sight, the lame walk, those who have leprosy are cleansed, the deaf hear, the dead are raised, and the good news is proclaimed to the poor." In other words, Jesus is saying, inspect the fruit. What do you see? The simple test is the tree bearing good or bad fruit. Then in Matthew 12:33, again further on in the Gospel, Jesus uses the same test to apply for everybody's lives. He says, make a tree and its fruit will be good, or make a tree bad. Make a tree good and its fruit will be good. Make a tree bad and its fruit will be bad. For a tree is recognized by its fruit. It's interesting, actually, when you consider that analogy, that we don't blame the fruit, do we? It's not about treating the symptoms, it's about getting back to the cause, isn't it? What is the tree connected to? So it's a question we should all ask of ourselves. What tree are we connected to? What is the source of our lives? Now back to the Sermon on the Mount. Jesus points us twice to this test in the story of the two trees. In verses 16 and 20, he says, by your fruit you will recognize them. And then again in verse 20, thus by their fruit you will recognize them. And so there are two possible outcomes from this. So at the bottom of the slide there. Do we bear good fruit, or are we thrown into the fire? That's what happens to a diseased tree. It is burnt up. Again, another big challenge, isn't it, from Jesus? Let's look at the third story. And this comes in Matthew 7:21 to 23. Again, hear the words on the screen. Jesus said, "Not everyone who says to me, 'Lord, Lord,' will enter the kingdom of heaven, but only the one who sees the will of my Father who is in heaven. Many will say to me on that day, 'Lord, Lord, did we not prophesy in your name, or in your name drive out demons, and in your name perform many miracles?' Then I will tell them plainly, 'I never knew you. Away from me, you evildoers.'" Tricky one again, isn't it? It's a difficult passage, this, actually. People calling Jesus the right thing, outwardly, would seem, wouldn't it? Lord, Lord, the correct way to address him. And also who seem to be doing the right things, driving out demons, performing miracles. There are two declarations that come from this. First, people calling Jesus the right thing, Lord, Lord. And the second declaration, Jesus' response, "I never knew you." Now, the advice when we encounter difficult passages is to read them slowly, to mull over them and consider what is actually being said here. And I think the key, the connection between these two declarations comes in the second half of verse 21 when Jesus says, "But only the one who does the will of my Father who is in heaven." The will of the Father, in essence, is the contrast between these two declarations. One way of summing it up could be to say, it's my will versus thy will. My will or God's will. Jesus is showing that there are people who claim they are working for God, but have never paused long enough to reflect on their motives. Why are they doing what they are doing? Here's the challenge. Am I doing what God has asked me to do, or am I doing what will make me look good? Am I working on God's behalf in the way he is asking me to do it? Or am I working in the way I like to do it? Did I ever substitute my agenda for his agenda? This is the contrast between my will and thy will. We must get to that point in our declaration of Jesus, where we call him what is right, where we work for him the right way, but recognise that this all goes away if we never pause and ask, God, what is your will? And so again in this story, there are two possible outcomes: to enter the kingdom versus to depart from God. When we constantly say, my will be done, then eventually Jesus says, you never really wanted to be with me, did you? But when we exchange my will for thy will, for God's will in our lives, then Jesus says, enter the kingdom. Which brings us to our fourth story, recorded in Matthew 7:24-27, which we've just heard Judith read. Jesus says, therefore, everyone who hears these words of mine and puts them into practice is like the wise man who built his house on the rock. The rain came down, the streams rose, and the winds blew against that house. Yet it did not fall, because it had its foundation on the rock. But everyone who hears these words of mine and does not put them into practice is like a foolish man who built his house on sand. The rain came down, the streams rose, the winds blew and beat against the house, and it fell with a great crash. This is similar to the first story of the two gates in that there are a lot of contrasts there again. Wise or foolish, the rock or the sand, doing or not doing, to stay firm or to fall. But in addition to the contrast, there is one constant between these two that remains the same for both the wise and for the foolish builder, and that is the rain falls, the wind blows, and the floods came. Jesus is clear that our best intentions in life will be challenged. Our plans will be tested. We know that all too well, don't we, from this last year or so. So whatever foundation we build our lives on, Jesus assures us will be shaken at some point. Time and tempest will reveal the wisdom or foolishness of life's choices. Now, the distinction between the wise and the foolish is directly connected to one thing: putting Jesus' words into practice or not. If we are willing to hear this Sermon on the Mount and say, yes, Jesus, I will not just listen to what you say, but I will do what you say, then we become like the wise builder. But if, having heard it, we decide to live life how we'd like to live, then we are like the foolish builder. So yes, once again, there are two possible outcomes. I did not fall, or great was the fall. Verse 27 says it fell with a great crash. There are two builders representing two outcomes to prepare us for our one responses. So it's only after these four stories about gates and trees, declarations and builders, and their corresponding two outcomes, each presenting the choice between life in the kingdom or life apart from the kingdom, that then the crowd, and perhaps us today, are sufficiently prepared to offer their one response. Let's look at verses 28 and 29. It says, when Jesus had finished saying these things, the crowds were amazed at his teaching, because he taught as one who had authority, not as their teachers of the law. Their response, amazement or astonishment. In fact, the Greek word used there is the word our English word epilepsy comes from. Such was the extent to which they were shaken by what Jesus had to say. And so their response was that shaken amazement, that astonishment that this person speaking has some kind of authority that they are not familiar with, which cause them to consider the need to reevaluate the authority under which they are currently living and maybe shift their lives under the authority of Jesus. The question for us: do you join the crowd in being shocked and amazed and shaken by Jesus' teaching and authority? And are you willing to submit to Jesus' authority? Or are you still living under your own authority? In simple summary, having heard the 4 stories and the 2 outcomes, we are asked for one response. Am I committed to my kingdom, or am I committed to Jesus' kingdom? And if you're committed to Jesus' kingdom, and you want to do that, then the action to take is to surrender to the King. I said Adam kicked off this sermon series 10 or so weeks ago on the kingdom with the Beatitudes at the start of the Sermon on the Mount in chapter 5. And the starting point was, blessed are the poor in spirit. A good point to start from, we said at the time, because it is by knowing that we are poor in spirit means that we recognise our need, our complete dependency on God, that all else follows from that starting point. We do all we do in life from that place of dependency on God. It's only when we realise that we haven't in ourselves got what it takes that we are then ready to turn to God. So maybe as we're coming to the end of this sermon series this morning, it's time to accept that we've had enough of struggling to do things our way, and it's time to surrender our lives to God's way, to recognise that we are poor in spirit and lost without God. So I'd just like to invite you now to take a moment in response to that, to surrender your lives to Jesus. Let's pray. Father, we surrender our lives to you. We accept your authority as our King. You who did not only say enter by the gates, but you who claim to be the gates. We come to you. You said that you are the true vine, and apart from me you will bear no fruit. We connect to you that we may be fruitful in our lives. You did not only speak of houses being built on rock, but said that you are the rock on which our lives are built. And so we simply say, I surrender my life to you now. Let's just say that. I surrender my life to you now. Amen.